And this seminar is organized by Institute of Asian Migration, IAM, and Waseda Institute of Asia Pacific Studies. So let me introduce today's speaker. Today's speaker is Dr. Zi Wang. Zi Wang is postdoctoral fellow and co-investigator of the research project Language, Migration, and Happiness among Chinese, Japanese, and Turkish communities in Germany, based at the University of Duisburg-Essen. He is the author of The Role of Language in the Happiness of Migrants, Routledge, The Discursive Construction of Hierarchy in Japan, and Addressing Migrants' Well-being During COVID-19. These works are funded by German Research Foundation and the European Commission. Today, so we have Dr. Ziwan as a speaker. So now, so I'd like to invite Ziwan for his speak. Let's welcome Dr. Ziwan. So please share screen whenever you want.
Thank you very much, Jotaro, for this very kind introduction. Let me share my screen here.
Please.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
You can see it. Okay, so thank you very much, Jotaro, once again, and thank you to the entire institute for giving me this chance to present, well, I guess, research still in the making in a certain way. And I have to say, even though I'm used to talking about my works everywhere, but it always feels very special to come back to my old school and give a talk. As I was just telling some of you just now, I graduated from Waseda actually 8 or 9 years ago, I guess. So it always feels very special to come back to this to where everything started, basically. So all right. As Jotaro kindly introduced, in the past few years, I've been developing a research agenda at the crossroads of migration and happiness or well-being. So basically trying to understand how one affects the other, in what kind of context and in which specific happiness or well-being dimensions. So against this framework and backdrop, I guess there is a lot, I guess there is a lot to say in terms of migrants' well-being during this COVID-19 situation. So in that case, I mean, we know already, because there have been lots of reports, there's been lots of, not really studies, but at least commissioned reports by major organizations talking about major consequences, notably reduced mobility, transnational ties. So if you have been doing field work at this very moment, or at least since last year, we know that migrants' family ties have been cut, their plans have been put on hold. There are also specific categories of seasonal workers, remittances, as you mentioned last month in some events. So that's really one huge aspect in terms of migrants' economic well-being, economic fulfillment and achievement and life satisfaction in that regard. And on the other hand, there's also for those people who are already in their destination country, we have a series of problems regarding acquiring residency status. We know that many Western European countries, they have actually stopped processing all sorts of visas. Last year for, I think France has stopped processing for as long as 6 months. So that has a huge consequence. And also in terms of for people who are already in destination countries, how to convert their temporary visa to a proper residency status has also been put on hold. And of course, there are different aspects such as accessing information and services, most notably because of this language barrier. Insofar as international migrants are concerned, coming from one place, bringing their own language to a new place, facing a foreign tongue, an environment in a foreign tongue. And there is a general lack of support infrastructure as far as Germany is concerned, as far as actually most Western European states are concerned. I'm not sure about the case in North America and in Australia, but at least that's from where I'm from and from where I am now, that's basically the general observation. Not to mention, it has also been flagged in various reports right now that ever since the beginning of the pandemic, in a Western context, East Asian looking people, not necessarily migrants, and that's the sad part, have been facing increased violence, discrimination, etc., etc. So these are really the focus of policy, of reports, of scholarship as of now. So if these are all very, very pertinent matters, then no matter how we understand an individual's happiness, no matter how we understand the concept of well-being, what we know for sure is that their well-being and happiness is definitely affected, right? No matter which of these areas is concerned, they all somehow affect one's feelings of happiness and well-being or life satisfaction. So what do we see from current scholarship up until now at the crossroads of migration and well-being in the context of this current pandemic? So actually, not a lot. There is actually a special issue recently published on COVID-19 and well-being, but only one article in that special issue addressed migrants' well-being. And it is especially surprising because most articles there, they really deal with large Western rich countries, all of whom have very high percentage of migrant populations in their general population. So that's a little bit perplexing. And of course, when we look at major outlets in migration studies, so in the field of migration studies, there are works published in a very timely manner dealing with COVID-19, different aspects, but very few actually dealt with well-being in article length, book length. Maybe book length is a bit too fast now, but in article length, proper empirical research articles. So I think there is really a need not just to consider that, but to do it in a timely manner regarding this, especially because, as I just mentioned, if you look at where in this region, in this part of the world, where I am now in the West, most countries, they have a very high percentage of international migrants. So we are talking about Germany here today. So Germany has even a slightly higher percentage than in the USA, than in the UK, right? The traditional receiving countries. And these are just really international migrants. So if we add on top of that, people with migration backgrounds, so also subjects of my study, which I will share later. So they can be considered natives of Germany or natives of Belgium or natives of France or UK, but their parents are from China, for example, or Japan, for example. If we add that to this group, then in the case of Germany, we go up to 23 to 25%, so a quarter basically of the population. So taking that into account, there is, I believe, specific need to think about how this particular group of people have what type of specific peculiar needs when a particular country, such as Germany, reflects on exit strategies, recovery efforts, right? To look at the well-being of such a large subgroup in the population as a whole. So what I'm going to present today is based on a exploratory study conducted in spring and summer last year, so almost a year ago, during Germany's first lockdown from April to June. So let me just explain how I arrived at this study. I wasn't planning on doing this study at all. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, I've been developing a research line along the borders of migration and well-being, happiness. So what I was looking at up until now is really the specific factors of education and language in terms of host country language acquisition and heritage language maintenance, and their effects on migrants, especially young migrants, feelings of happiness in a host society. So that was what I was looking at. And considering that, I was especially interested in looking at how non-formal community educational programs deal with this, help their migrant members. So last year, this time, I was actually doing interviews, observations, distributing surveys in all these kind of community organizations. And then COVID came, as we all know. So with COVID, education is severely affected. As we all know, what happened afterwards, public schools in probably much of Europe closed, so Germany too. Public schools closed, I think, on 16th of March. And also, of course, there are government policies saying, okay, you should reduce contact and whatsoever. So of course, such community programs were also disrupted. They were not allowed to function. They were not allowed to carry on, at least physically, right? But as I was observing back then, various migrant communities, I realized that one group stood out for being particularly creative and resilient, creative in devising new ways to meet their members' needs, and resilient to this persistent pandemic. And that's actually the Chinese community. So then I thought, well, if that's the case, how about let me find out how the Chinese community initiatives address the migrant children's and parents' well-being needs, or not at all, because that was really something unprecedented. So I thought, oh, that's a nice chance to find out. And what kind of well-being needs are we talking about here? Actually, it's not just in terms of emotion. Of course, that's part of it, right? But more than just the emotional and psychological state of feeling good, or feeling, yeah, today is a good day, tomorrow will be a nice day as well. It's really also about enabling experiences. And in the context of education, in the context of youth, that really translates to giving them enabling experiences, making them have the feeling that they are functioning well in this educational context. So that the most direct way to say is, okay, so they have their continuity in education, they're achieving something, they're learning something, so they have this enabling experience, feeling that that's useful, they have achieved something, and that really helps them in boosting their self-confidence, both in school and also for future. So some concrete things I was trying to look for are provision of companionship, of course, sense of belonging in a community, of course, academic continuation, and progress despite disruption. So I thought, let me observe if any of these was present or was provided for by such community initiatives in the Chinese case. So just very briefly, because the Chinese community, the Chinese community in Germany, they're still a very understudied group, especially compared to some other migrant groups in Germany, such as the Turkish group, such as the Italians, the Greeks, and the Russians, for example. So one reason is, of course, because they still constitute a minority. So they're not even in the top 10. I don't think they're even in the top 15 or 20 in terms of absolute numbers. But in any case, I think it is still important to look at the Chinese community building as a whole in Germany for two main reasons, as I list here. The first reason is actually the Chinese community building has a very long history, longer than actually, in fact, most present-day migrant communities in Germany, stretching back to the 19th century, so that by the early 20th century, we could already see very established Chinatowns in cities such as Hamburg, Bremen, Berlin, for example. So there's actually a very long history of community building in Germany. So that's for one. The second reason, which I think is more pertinent, is that although small, the Chinese represent the fastest growing non-EU migrant group in Germany. So just to give you an idea, we can see that these are some of the top non-EU migrant sending countries to Germany from two time periods. So if we observe the difference between the first time period from 1980 to 1990, and the second period from 2005 to 2015, we see that only in this Chinese group is there an exponential increase. So they are really the fastest growing non-EU migrant group in Germany. So if current trends continue, it could well be that they would be among one of the largest groups in the not too distant future. So having said that, how to look at Chinese communities? There are, of course, different ways depending on what one wants to look at. So in my current research agenda, I'm of course focusing on community initiatives in education, and especially in educational efforts in providing language instruction and language maintenance support. So if that is the case, then what I'm looking at here is a type of organization called the Chinese Heritage Language Schools. Why look at that, and why is there such an organization? Well, language is a very crucial element. We often don't realize it, but wherever we go, we bring our language with us. And with that, of course, our identity, our culture. So migrants, they, of course, as a first generation migrant, they face this problem themselves. They bring their language with them, say in this case from China to Germany. They're confronted with a new language. So there is this first confrontation going on. And of course, then they have to invest in learning the host country language, whatever. But it becomes even harder if they have offspring. So if a second generation is involved, was born in Germany, there are even more difficult decisions and choices to be made. What should I do with this heritage? How to strike a balance between transmitting and maintaining this to the next generation and making sure that the next generation achieves native German level or native host country, native level in host country language, so that nothing is jeopardized just because of a lack of German skills or host country language skills. So the choices become harder, right, when second generation is involved. So in this context, such heritage language schools step in as community infrastructure to try to support migrants and their offspring. And there are, of course, different active stakeholders. So the host society could play an active role, which is the case in Sweden. Sorry. We also see in the case of Germany with the Turks, there is a collaboration between the host society, which is Germany, and the sending country, which is Turkey, in terms of collaborating in terms of one state through its local education boards provide material support, whereas another state provides, for example, human resources. And we also see in the case of Japan, where the sending country dominates in providing money, in building, in the schools, in sending teachers, dispatching teachers, sending teaching materials. So the sending country, as in the case with the Japanese communities, plays a dominant role. So there are different models with different active stakeholders. With the Chinese case, most of them, they are private initiatives. They're private initiatives, and most of them, they are very small in scale, so nothing compared to the kind of huge, for example, Japanese schools we see in Düsseldorf here or in London, for example. They are really rather small. They're private. They rely on themselves to fund their initiatives, to make their own materials. And the Chinese schools in Germany, they are established in different waves. So the first wave from, we could say from the late 50s, early 60s to 80s, they were founded by Taiwanese merchants, or rather, to be more accurate, family members of Taiwanese merchants. And they have their association called the Union of Chinese Schools in Germany. They use the word in English, they use the word Chinese because, I mean, as one Taiwanese school told me, they were the only Chinese up until the 80s or early 90s. They were the only Chinese in Germany. So they were used to that. And of course, from the 1990s to 2000s, there's a newer wave run by mainland Chinese. And they also have their own associations and unions, but the numbers here, they don't say everything. So that's not the total number of schools, total number of heritage language schools in Germany, because many, they don't know or they don't want to be part of such associations because they say it's too restrictive. They couldn't, they would not be free to do whatever they want. So my study last spring was conducted in such a smaller scale, newer schools, not funded, but basically established by mainland Chinese merchants and their family members. So this is an overview of the schools concerned where I did my exploratory study. So these three cities are where the schools were located. So these three cities, they have quite a large number of Chinese community. So their scale is considered pretty large in the landscape of Chinese heritage language schools. And we can see that here in all three places, local schools closed at the same time on 16th of March. But all of them started already their online courses in February, or at least by the latest at the end of the first week of March. So they reacted very, very, very fast, way quicker than local public schools. So that was also something noticeable. And one thing to emphasize is that these schools, they are only weekend schools. So they don't provide the kind of full school curriculum as an alternative to public schools. They are only weekend schools. So all these kids here, they attend local public schools, and they only go to these schools with or without Corona, only on weekends, just to learn Chinese. So they're really not, they don't provide anything else. That has to be made clear. And what I did was, of course, a series of back and forth, very long written correspondences with all these groups via emails, and they were kind enough to invite me to join their WeChat channels because by then it was already impossible to travel to these schools on site. There were travel restrictions, and they had, in any case, no longer physical activities going on. So how did these schools address migrants' needs and well-being? The first way in which they did that was they expanded their course offering in language. So as I mentioned, by March, early March, they shut down their physical facilities. They canceled all their physical schools. But in the WeChat channels, what I observed was that, of course, parents voice concerns. But what the schools said was that they used this motto, which I think was very, very apt for them, that don't worry, just because classes they meant physical classes, stop. It doesn't mean your child's learning will stop. So they had this from the beginning, they had this reassuring message delivered to parents that don't worry, your child's learning will not stop. And how did they do that? The first thing was they increased the time slots for existing language classes and added new ones. And here we have, for example, a rationale for that. So the schools wanted, they knew, because the schools, they have been here for a long time and they were run by people who have been in Germany for several decades. And they know that it would be a chaotic situation in the public school sector because there's a lack in digitalization, there's a lack in qualified teachers, tech-savvy teachers, basically, who would know immediately how to transit smoothly to online teaching. So they anticipated that. So they said, well, we increased everything because we wanted to maintain the learning rhythm for our kids. Don't worry, that's going to be maintained so that they can still feel that they're trying to achieve something. So instead, how did they do that? Instead of their original course offering of just one big Chinese language class for primary school kids, for lower secondary and higher secondary kids on a Saturday afternoon, they split the big Chinese class into smaller, more specific classes. One class on writing, one class on learning the pinyin, one class on reading, etc., etc. So out of a sudden, they had, even though they were still teaching Chinese language, they had way more classes with way more time slots so that students could find something to do, basically. And it was the same reaction elsewhere. So this is taken from this is a teaching an advertisement for their new course in response to Corona in Düsseldorf. So from here, we see that this is a brand new thing, nothing like that before. Storytelling, learning Chinese via storytelling. You wouldn't, before Corona, you wouldn't think that, okay, I will send my kids to this particular heritage language school. They will learn Chinese via storytelling. They would just learn Chinese. In that one class, they learn a little bit of everything. So this is how they kind of specialized by creating more language-related classes in a way to really occupy the kids' time. Right. And also in a fun way, I have to say, in a fun way. So it's not really more homework, but really in a fun way. So as one teacher explained, why was that? Everybody was mentally stressed. The kids were restless. And so they were thinking in their meetings about ways to not only keep the kids occupied, but also make sure that they have an enjoyable time. And this was especially important given the situation outside, or what's happening when we looked at the chaotic scenes in the public school sector, right? And demand was actually pretty good. So they really started, in the end, 5 days a week with different time slots. And I have to say, it was pretty strategically planned because they planned for this on weekday afternoons. So their rationale was that, well, our kids, they can attend their local public schools online classes in the mornings. If it works, that's fine. But we know that half the time, or probably like very often, it wouldn't work. If that's the case, they still wouldn't feel that their days are gone, are wasted, because they can immediately switch to our channels, to our course offerings in the afternoons. So they still have this feeling that every day there's something going on. So that's how they plan it. And through that, really, and with storytelling, for example, into smaller groups with more time offerings, there was this sense of companionship, even if only virtually. But there's this sense of companionship, especially important for the kids in a time when you're not supposed to meet your friends and play with your friends in school, for example. But of course, at the same time, maintaining a daily learning rhythm, even though if it's just for say 2 hours or 1.5 hours, but it's something that goes on every day. And it's something that went on every day without much of a problem, in stark contrast to what happened in several public schools, for example. So that went really well. So their first response of expanding classes went really well. And in WeChat, in the WeChat channels, the parents were really satisfied. Most parents, not all, but most parents were really satisfied, and they started asking if the schools could do more. They started asking, "Hey, look, now this pandemic seems like it's going to stay, and Easter is coming up. Usually, you know, we have nice Easter plans, either traveling, but not necessarily traveling, just say we take a break with the kids, we do something nice, but now we can't do anything during Easter. So the parents were kind of asking the schools if they could save their Easter, their kids, to prevent their kids from getting more restless. And of course, they were also very unhappy by then with public schools online teaching. So on the one hand, I already mentioned, because of poor infrastructure, lack of tech-savvy teachers, lack of digitalization in schools is a huge problem in Germany. Anyway, everybody knows about that. Nobody wants to do anything about it. But on the other hand, it's also because of poor language skills. So even if there's no problem with the online teaching in their public schools, it's what they say was that it was very difficult for them, if they're not familiar with the language, to follow online teaching in math, in science, in German, for example. There was no chance to ask the teacher. There's no chance to really raise your hand to ask your teacher to repeat. And afterwards, once the teacher logs out, that's it. And when you ask your parents don't understand the mathematical problem or the scientific explanation, because everything was in German, which was too much for the parents. So that's also a point. So it's not just poor digital infrastructure, but also poor language skills on the part of migrant parents and children. So these two combined really made them very unsatisfied with online teaching as a whole. So with that in mind, and this I think is what is really particular, the CHL schools, they went beyond their original mission in teaching language. So they kind of started by Easter last year, creating non-language related classes, which I think is pretty brave of them to do, because we also had to know that they had no additional resources for that. They had to rely on more volunteers. They don't receive state aid from neither the German side nor the Chinese or Taiwanese side. So that we have to be clear. So for example, we have one case here in Munich, the Heritage Language School offered Python classes twice weekly for some of their older students, just to test out how that would be, with the aim of preventing fatigue for their older students, and also as a way to stimulate their intellectual curiosity during a very difficult time. And in Düsseldorf, there was something called a virtual Easter learning camp. So Easter holiday, public schools, after a month and a half of mediocre online teaching, shut completely because of Easter. Kids were restless. And in this case, the CHL school in Düsseldorf, there was not only Chinese classes on offer, and again, you see, you can learn not just the language as one language class, boring language class, but you have even poetry. On top of that, there are math classes in the Easter camp, another programming class in the Easter camp. And for the first time, for parents, yoga. And what is particular is also all these classes are conducted in Chinese. They're conducted in Chinese. And I think especially judging from the responses and parents' comments to the classes, especially the math classes, really helped out because this is not just something to make sure that the kids have something to do while in the eyes of parents, migrant parents, state schools failed, but also teaching something which is also taught in state schools, but in their own language, making sure that they really understand some of the concepts. So I think this is something that's even more commendable in this case. So, and also, of course, if you do that in their own language, then of course, there are previous complaints about maths or science subjects in local public schools would fade away if they really understand the same concepts, right? And if parents could also help in explaining the same concepts. So there is a confidence booster and a sense of achievement here at play. Not only that, in the post-lockdown, this word sounds very illusory right now, actually, but there was a period of post-lockdown last summer. Parents were also unhappy because local schools insisted on continuing with their summer break. So I believe last year, public schools reopened in June, early June or the second week of June. And the summer break was scheduled to start at the end of June, and it went as planned. So parents were really unsatisfied because they were out of job. Many parents were out of job. And they say that, well, if we only had 2 weeks, that's not enough time for us to seek re-employment because we really cannot deal with childcare again at home for almost 2 months of summer break. So they asked the CHL schools if they could do something, to free this time the parents up so that the parents could go out and seek employment. Many of them, they are in informal sectors, many of them work in restaurants anyway. And that was the time when the restaurants started to open. Right, there was a time when restaurants services started to open, and they thought, we really cannot deal with childcare now again. So they asked the CHL schools if they could do anything about it. And back then, it was a time, as I said, of post-lockdown. So physical activities were allowed once again. So this time they decided to do something on-site. So they offered something in a similar idea to Easter training camp, but instead virtually, this time really physically on-site. So this is a sample timetable of a summer camp offered by the CHL schools. So we can see that they have actually different phases from early July all the way to early August. So in a way, it corresponded to the first full month of summer break of local schools. And what they proposed was that, okay, so let's do something still fun, but still intellectually stimulating. So what is intellectually stimulating? Mathematics. So you come here for math lecture, for math exercise, everything again in Chinese, which I thought was a very good idea, regardless of Corona or not, which I think was a very good idea, a nice gesture on the part of CHL schools to offer that to Chinese-speaking migrants. But not only math, because you want them to have this general feeling of well-being in terms of also health, because they thought, okay, after staying 2-3 months at home, you should move a little bit. So there's this, for those who wanted, there was this table tennis option. And so they offered this pretty much, I mean, from 9 to almost 3 p.m. It's a pretty long time, at least in summer, at least during school break times. And that really gave parents additional time to seek re-employment, because as I mentioned earlier, that was really the perfect timing for many of them who worked before Corona in Chinese restaurants, for example, right? In this kind of beauty salons, like doing nails, beauty salons, which were all closed, right, during the lockdown. So this was the perfect timing for them to really engage in such activities. So there was also something for the parents in terms of enabling experience in being able to put that kids aside, knowing that they're taken care of, and go out to look for employment. So what can we see from this range of activities? The ways in which CHL schools responded to Corona. So we have seen that they really tried to maintain, first and foremost, a healthy learning rhythm. It really, the point was really not providing online cram schools from 6 in the morning to 10 in the evening, but rather 1 to 2 hours per day, but maintaining a learning rhythm. At least the kids knew that there's something that they could do, even if they couldn't understand their public schools online lectures, even if their public schools online lectures didn't work. At least they knew that every day they had something to do. They had something to learn. So there is this sense of achievement and fulfillment in terms of not just heritage language, but also other courses. As I mentioned, especially in math, that was very, very important. And towards the end, even for adults with yoga classes conducted in Chinese, again, trying to provide adults with some form of, I guess, entertainment during this very difficult time. And of course, it freed parents up, right? It freed parents up with their, especially on-site summer camp plus childcare offer, right? And ultimately, apart from teaching the heritage language, they really, in a way, of course, not completely because it is not possible, but to some extent, they fill the gap left behind by local schools. Why is that? Because in my interactions with parents, they say that there was no point in asking, in giving feedback to local schools because they wouldn't do anything. There was no point in telling my children's local school that your online platform is not working or your teachers are not tech savvy enough, because nothing would happen. So instead, they would prefer at every stage when they needed help to talk to such organizations, Chinese heritage language schools, and ask if they could do something. So, and I put in quotation marks, local institutions failed. It's not all the case because, for example, in the case of maths, it's also because of the language barrier. So even if everything is provided smoothly, if parents and their children don't understand what's going on, that's also, but to their lived experience, local institutions failed. That's what they meant. And so parents at each stage always referred to the heritage language schools and asked them for help. And these schools, they were actually pretty flexible, I have to say. I mean, of course, I mean, they were, I mean, compared to local public schools, they were not bound by any hard and fast regulations and whatsoever. So I guess that's also why. And one other thing I realized is that with this Corona experience, we see that even though such language schools, they are sites of learning, they are Asian sites of learning, but what actually happened in here is not the typical image that Westerners here have. If you talk about me as a parent bringing my children and dumping them in this cram school, and they just learn all day, nothing but memorize. Actually, there was a lot more emphasis on games, on fun, right? Storytelling, learning via storytelling, learning math via games, learning Scratch programming via games, yoga, right? So there are a lot more emphasis on games, fun, and companionship, not more homework. So that's also something that I think is worthy of attention. So it's really not something that's remote learning, not the typical impression that people here have when they think, oh, that must be a cram school. No, that's not the case. And of course, generally speaking, when schools are closed, I mean, I'm not sure about the situation in Japan right now, but now, I mean, it's the second or I don't know, almost third wave of lockdown in much of Europe, and in many countries, schools are closed again or have been closed for quite some time already. And each time when there's a school closure or non-school closure, because some countries, they don't want to close schools, this is always one of the hottest topics, most contested topics for discussion. And rightly so, I guess, because there are really important ramifications on general student population's learning and achievement, especially in reading, especially in mathematics. Some estimates even say that, well, with this second, third wave of lockdown school closure, by this summer, students who went through last year, they have more than 1 year of lacking knowledge in math, for example, and reading, which is actually a very large gap for general student populations. And in this case, my research subjects, the migrants, they are even more vulnerable, as I mentioned, because of language issues. So in this case, we see such migrant communities going one step beyond their original mission of simply teaching the heritage language in helping to bridge this gap by offering math classes in Chinese. And the question to us is, of course, could local schools and migrant organizations like this collaborate in the future, explore different ways to collaborate to help more vulnerable population? Of course, more studies are needed. That goes without saying. Also, especially because what I did was but an exploratory study, so it's limited in scale, limited in time, and actually it's not only limited to one migrant community, but limited to one subgroup within the Chinese communities, because there are in fact many Chinese communities in Germany, in France, in the United States, I guess in Japan as well, and they are defined by national, political, cultural boundaries, and these are all publicly acknowledged by such schools. So depending on their affiliation, right, as I mentioned earlier, either to this Taiwanese network or the Chinese network, they have different teaching practices. They use different teaching materials. They speak differently, even though all claim that their Mandarin is the authentic Mandarin. What they teach is the authentic Chinese culture to the offspring of Chinese in Germany. And that also affected, to a certain extent, my fieldwork access. So I'm a Singaporean German, which is pretty weird in this situation when I was trying to look for such fieldwork sites, because to the Chinese schools, they know that I'm not from China, I'm not from Taiwan, so they immediately thought, you're an outsider, maybe we shouldn't trust you. But they also know that, but somehow you're also not really German. You're not the German we have in mind. So that had an impact. And in the end, I mean, I had very limited time to negotiate access to follow their online programs and to interview with people. So I was only granted access by one camp, which by now you know that is the mainland Chinese camp. That's where I did the data collection. Is time the only factor? If I had more time, would it have been also possible for me to gain the trust and acceptance of the Taiwanese camp? I'm not sure. Or if I were a white European German, for example, but with the same level of Chinese language skills, would it have been easier for the other camps to accept me? I'm not sure. So that's one of the limits, limits as well in this. So as I mentioned, future studies definitely needed to broaden the scope. Notably, some questions in mind are, of course, how have Chinese communities elsewhere reacted in France, in the UK, in the United States, for example, are they similar? Are they different? Why is that? And also, what about even in Germany? How about other communities? For example, the Japanese schools in Düsseldorf, in Frankfurt, in Munich, did they have something similar? Or is it really something that's peculiar to this Chinese or mainland Chinese case? And with more knowledge, it would of course be easier to explore the synergy between community initiatives and public institutions. We don't even need a pandemic, but even in a normal time, such a synergy, I think, is always welcome. And lastly, what I discussed today is described in full in a recent article I published last month, and is completely free access online. You don't need to have any institutional login. So if you are interested, please go and take a look. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ziwang, for your talk. So Professor Farrer, could you still take care of the QA?
Okay, we have a division of labor here. So, okay, I think we already have some questions. I think I just go through the order and see if I can combine some. But basically, I think what Jotaro and I'm sorry, I'm just jumping in here, have a similar questions. Could you say a bit more about the background of these Chinese migrants and the people who send their children to the Chinese school? Because it seems like they're engaged in all kinds of trades.
Yes. In fact, insofar as these three schools are concerned, the backgrounds are pretty diverse. So some of them, they are pretty diverse, and we can understand that in different ways. In terms of their jobs, it's really diverse. Even though I have to say a lot. I think I talked to 30 to 50 parents. They all work in Chinese restaurants. So that's definitely one group. And by that, I think we know that that's a very informal kind of employment. So they were also not entitled to any kind of state aid during this lockdown period. So that we have one group like that. We have one group who works for big Chinese companies based in this region. So this region has actually a lot of Chinese companies. There's Huawei. There are a lot. Huawei is the most notable example, and many parents work for that company, work for Huawei. We would think that they tend to be more well off. But I talked to the principal actually in Bonn, and he said that many of his parents they work for Huawei, and it's the headquarters in Europe. But he said that what he said was that many of his parents told him that because they're Chinese, their contract is different from Germans who work for Huawei, so they receive less pay, and in terms of social security and protection is also something specially negotiated with them. But nonetheless, it's more stable than those group working in the restaurants. So we have that group as well, Huawei plus some other big Chinese firms. We also have, if not in terms of family background, diversity. So in Munich, especially in Munich, many families, they are mixed families. So to begin with, many of the kids, their German is as good as Chinese, or rather their Chinese is as good as German. Some of them, they don't speak Mandarin, but they speak Cantonese or some other languages. So in terms of that, we have diversity as well. I think the general impression is that in China, possibly they would be considered pretty well off, so above average, the kind of standards. But when they changed to here, because of the nature of work, either because they work informally or because they have the kind of second-class contracts, even in a Chinese company, here, they are actually very average families. I have to say, very average families. And from what some parents told me, the fact that they are average also is manifested in the fact that they have lots of problems in public schools, because they say, see, we can only send our kids to public schools, even though we really hate public schools here for a lot of different reasons. Those who are really well off, or those who could afford it, they actually choose international schools. And I'm not sure how international schools dealt with their digital infrastructure, because there was no chance to look at that. So I guess it's pretty diverse. They really have, they're engaged in all kinds of trades, but I guess very few fancy. There are also a lot of self-employed. So supermarket owners, but supermarket is a big word. Market owners, like small shop owners, restaurant, eatery owners. So a lot of self-employed. That's definitely the case. Self-employed. Yeah.
Right. So these are mostly recent migrants, not migrants who have lived in Germany for a long time.
Yeah. So most of the, in most cases, so they are all families with children. So in most cases, the parents they came, and if we look at in these three schools, the primary school age cohort, most of the children, they are born in Germany. If you look at the secondary school cohort, most of the children, just like the parents, they're born in China, but they came with them. So I would say, yeah, they are pretty recent. Yeah.
I think several people also have questions about the Chinese schools themselves. So who are teaching in those schools? And also, I'm also curious to know, to what degree what they are doing during COVID is not an extension of what they were doing before COVID? Or do you see a changing role? In a sense, COVID has actually intensified this particular role, this Chinese language school played in Chinese community, or they're just, doing something that they have always been doing?
Okay. So who are teaching these schools? So the schools where I've been collecting data, they are all, as I mentioned, private initiatives. There are very few schools actually. So it's really not like the Japanese school system. There are very few Chinese-speaking heritage language organizations funded to the same extent by either China or Taiwan as the Japanese schools are by Japan here. So I think that's the one thing that we have to be absolutely clear. With that in mind, we know that they don't receive resources such as teachers dispatched from China or Taiwan. At best, they receive from the Chinese or Taiwanese consulates old teaching materials which they could use. So in that regard, most of the teachers, they are actually either parents or students. So if you are a Chinese parent, if you are a Chinese student studying in Germany, for example, this is one way of working part-time, or in many cases volunteering in the community. If you're a Taiwanese, merchant, what's very common is the wives of Taiwanese businessmen who founded some schools themselves and who also become teachers themselves. If you're a Taiwanese student, that's one way of volunteering or earning a little bit of pocket money in that regard. So they're not professional full-time teachers dispatched from China or Taiwan. So that's about the teachers, and about what they're doing now. If to what extent it's an extension of what they have already been doing pre-COVID. I think regarding heritage language, that's definitely the case, because that's their original mission. They have been very active in helping migrant families, promoting and transmitting Chinese language, be it in the Chinese schools or the Taiwanese schools. They have been very active for 3, 4, 5 decades, many of them. especially the Taiwanese ones. And with this COVID, of course, they enriched their heritage language curriculum. That's for sure. So I see in that regard, I see that this is an extension, but a very enriched extension. But what is new, I think, is really the non-language related offerings in these schools. Because before that, there was really nothing about teaching maths and programming or yoga to either parents or to the children. It was really because really before the school shut down, before COVID, it was really a place where people went on a Saturday afternoon for 2 hours of Chinese, and they went home. And they gathered, it was, if there were any special activities, it was during Mid-Autumn and Chinese New Year. So like twice or 3 times a year, then they had a party and whatsoever, and that's it. So I think, I'm not sure if they will continue, but I think this is certainly something new, the non-language related curriculum. If they could continue, I think that would be something, I guess, positive and really something that breaks away from old traditions of these places in pre-COVID times.
Right. Because I did a participant observation at a Chinese heritage school, weekend Chinese language school in Japan for like 2 years, because my daughter went there for actually more than 2 years, for several years. And one actual function of Chinese heritage school, a language school, is for the parents to sit in a room. We have a waiting room and chit chat. So it's a kind of community function as well. So I wonder if this online yoga class replaces that kind of a community function. And also the Chinese school here in Japan, they also will teach like English and other kind of cram school curriculum to kids, even when there's no COVID. I'm not following up on the COVID. So I wonder if in the future, you can look into the language school as more like a community rather just than a language school for children. And also, I'm sorry, I'm just, and also here we have questions about, so why, Chinese parents don't want to send their children to, say, German schools, or they would rather send to international schools. And also we have questions, again, I think it's from Roland, talking about, you want you to elaborate a little bit on the parents' language choices and why your articles mentioned that teaching non-Mandarin pupils is difficult. So what do you know if by now the schools found a solution? It's about a school. I think it's Roland had
I see that now. Okay. So thank you for the idea of heritage language schools as community. I think that's a fascinating idea, and there certainly is a function. Communal space is certainly ongoing there. As far as I know, the heritage schools here, the offering was not as wide-ranging as what you just described concerning the heritage school in Tokyo. But I think they might continue with this even when the pandemic is over, be it online or on site. So it's certainly something to watch out in the long term. So going to this question I see here, teaching non-Mandarin pupils. So by that, that's actually in the article. That actually, I was referring to interviews with some school principals, because they say that some pupils, they don't speak Mandarin actually. So their real heritage language is Cantonese, for example. But there's no heritage language school in Germany that teaches Cantonese as a heritage language. They all teach Mandarin. So for these parents, the rationale is that at least is one of the Chinese languages. So kind of feels familiar. So we send our kids to this school, no problem. We don't have a choice anyway. But then the difficulty is, of course, there is no home support for Mandarin learning. And for them, what is a relief for the majority of children and parents came to them as a burden, because everybody faced kind of the same problem in public schools. Either the online teaching platform didn't work, or if it worked, the German was too difficult. When it comes to math, when it comes to science subjects, it was too difficult. So they sought help in this Chinese heritage language platform. So everything was explained in Mandarin. There was no problem for the majority of those who took part. But for those whose home language was neither German nor Mandarin, it was still the same problem actually. So only doubled. They out of a sudden they had problems in the local schools and they had problems in this heritage context. So for this minority group of students whose home language was Cantonese, I think it was in Bonn, in the article I mentioned, they had 10 or a dozen families, Cantonese speaking families. So they, at the end, they say, well, then we just drop out. So that was really pity. And I think ultimately how to deal with this group of people, and not only Cantonese speaking, there are also children whose home language is rather German than Chinese, than Mandarin, I mean. So I think in the longer term, how such community initiatives could deal with this group of pupils would also show how inclusive some of their practices and policies could be, which in the longer term can only do good to this community as a whole. But as an emergency response, I guess what they did was they tried to take care of the needs of the majority, and it's a pity in that case. That's for sure. Yeah.
Right, because we are still lingering on the school issue, so I just jump ahead and ask this question posed by Farrar. I think she wants to know whether the kids actually were really kind of exhausted by all this online teaching, and you know, have you gotten some perspectives from the school students who you know, participate in those programs?
Directly from the students, unfortunately, no, because I had absolutely no chance of meeting anybody in this, because usually before that, I would go to a classroom like this and talk to the teachers, the parents, and play around and chat with the children. But in this case, what they did was they brought me into their channel, but there were no students, no kids. So it was only parents and the educators. But from what the parents said, I think what really did the kids good was the Easter camp and the table tennis and math camp. And for the older kids in Munich, they say that because the kids afterwards, they started their own chat group on programming. So I thought, okay, from that, I could see that some of these most innovative responses being brought out had kind of a rather agreeable effect on their learning. But I'm not sure, for example, if kids would feel really lethargic and very, very exhausted from the storytelling classes going on every day and whatsoever. But what I also have to say is that in the chat group, many parents simply said that because after a while they felt that, okay, there are actually quite a lot of things going on in the online platforms in heritage language schools. So many parents, what they did was that they simply told their kids to just stop following the local public school thing, because either it didn't work or they didn't understand the things anyway. So I think to another group of people, it's not really a double burden, because they ultimately chose completely to ignore one group. So that left them with, I guess, 2 hours or so on average per day of learning something online. Yeah.
That's interesting. They're kind of replacing the kind of formal school education, and because of the cultural difficulties. And Professor Alan Keen is also here. I think he posted a question here. You've talked about how they rely on informal social resources to solve the problems that's facing them right now. But how did the community members solve other complex problems in the areas of employment, housing, ethnic prejudice, and among others? Did they also mostly depend on informal social networks? Can you see?
Well, this, yeah, I see the question here. This is a very pertinent question. Of course, that's out of the scope of this current study, but I think in the area of employment, what I can say is that, and this is, I think this has less to do with this particular study, but with what I generally observed with some of the schools here. Some of the schools here, they had they had a very strong link with the local Chinese community. So one example is that in another city across the Rhine River, in a city called Neuss, there's a Chinese heritage language school located in the middle of an abundant industrial park. A group of Chinese merchants bought this whole industrial park. They built some warehouses for this train, this 1-belt 1-road train, because it stops somewhere here. So they built some warehouses, created some jobs. And last year, 2019, so 2 years ago, they built a small-scale supermarket to cater originally to the workers working on this industrial site, so in the warehouses. But that expanded a little bit, so there were more jobs. And right in this industrial park and right next to this supermarket and the warehouses, they built a Chinese temple. They built a heritage language school. So in this particular case, I can't generalize, but in this particular case, indeed, we could see that this whole community function of interlinked, I guess, they all depend on each other, and they are all helping each other by creating more jobs, by bringing in more people in the first place, by creating more jobs to people who might not necessarily, in a very easy way, find attractive employment just like this outside, because many of them, they speak Chinese and Chinese only. And at the same time, there's this school and a Buddhist temple for people to pray. So I think this is, in that case, we see, I'm not sure if that actually, I mean, employment to some extent, but in terms of ethnic prejudice, I don't think it did terribly lot to really address other issues, but it nonetheless, this whole thing taken as a whole provided some kind of, I guess, respite or a safe haven, if you will, even if just for 1 or 2 days per week during pre-corona times. Yeah, that's something concrete I've seen and observed, and what I can answer regarding this question at this stage. Yeah.
Right. Alan, do you have any follow-up you want to pursue?
Thank you for answering the question. No, that's enough. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We also have questions here. I think again, Faraz's question is about, the parents, maybe they're from different income, social economic backgrounds, and also they're from different regions of China. And are they all in the same, language school? Do you see any kind of internal differentiation, among these Chinese in those heritage schools, like the class differences or that sort of cliquiness in that sort of aspect?
Yeah. So I mean, now what the schools in their channels, what they're discussing is whether or not to start a variety of music classes. So violin, ballet, for example, because they thought we did yoga for adults, we can also do ballet for our younger children. So now they are discussing whether or not and how. I think they've decided, but so they're discussing how to start violin and ballet classes, and they are also asking for parents' opinion. And from that, I mean, we can see there are people. I mean, really to look at class differences or different differentiations, I think is really you'll be better to observe that on site. But just based on what is going on now in the discussions, what I can see is that, of course, not everyone appreciates the same kind of offers. Some really just wanted mass tuition to continue. Some just wanted a good Chinese language foundation to continue. But there are others saying that we can pay more for other kind of classes, even post-COVID, if you have ballet, if you have a violin or whatsoever. So I guess there's something emerging. There's something emerging from these discussions, insofar as what I can observe right now. Regarding regional differences and whatsoever. So of course, one regional difference is the Cantonese group of speakers. So that's definitely there. Another more macro level difference is already the split between the mainland Chinese and Taiwanese camp of schools. So that's already a difference. But mainland China is so big. So even in the mainland Chinese schools, we have Cantonese for sure. And they have been, unfortunately, in this incidents, a little bit sidelined. But other than that, I think the mainland Chinese communities here, they are still too young. That's for one, and second, no one significant region of origin dominates the whole landscape. So I guess they are way too dispersed and diverse in terms of regions of origin within mainland China, for example, to really form the thing as what we would see, for example, in the Parisian Chinese communities in France. There's this huge Wenzhou clique. There's this huge Southeast Asian ethnic Chinese clique speaking Cantonese. There's this huge Shanghainese clique. So something to that extent, I think is coming, but haven't noticed that to that extent. Yeah.
Okay. We also have a question here regarding mental well-being. I think it's from Mire Kato Mire, and the question I think you can also see. So do people actually talk about the mental illness, and do they seek help? And what you observe in the Chinese community, are there any kind of services that actually around helping people deal with the mental issues?
Explicitly talking about mental, I mean, I guess this is a more general question, not particularly restrained to the COVID context. So generally speaking, talking about this kind of things, I have not observed and heard in this community spaces, in these language schools. So that's for one, and I think. In the general context of addressing mental well-being, that's a very good point. But I really don't see how or any specific explicit efforts by such community organizations to tackle such a problem. It definitely exists, but on the one hand, it's not often talked about by migrants themselves. In this COVID case is very particular because we also have to understand that I think this is something that's got to do with the Chinese psyche. It doesn't have to be, and it transcends national boundaries. So it doesn't matter if you're from China or Taiwan or ethnic Chinese from Southeast Asia, like myself. Education strikes a nerve in us. because when it comes to education, we go all out. It doesn't have to be remote learning and memorizing 20 hours a day, but it's just the importance we attach to education, especially children's education. So I think in this very specific case with COVID and the education of their children at stake in public schools, they started talking about what can you do to help my child, because my child is so restless, my child is so depressed, and something like that. I think that struck a particular nerve in the Chinese psyche, because it has got to do with education, and especially education for the next generation. So that's something rather particular. And as I mentioned, my study and the article is really about well-being in this educational context. In a general sense, I think this is, as far as I've observed, less talked about, and I don't see as of now any explicit measures, either pre-COVID or now, of these schools really saying that this is some of our things on offer. People with depression or because of sustained ethnic prejudice in Germany or whatsoever, you can come seek help, or there's a hotline or consultation or whatsoever. That's at least until now, I've not seen things like that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Do we have other questions and comments for Zi? I think it's a fascinating topic, Wang Zi, and I think it would be very valuable if you can compare, this Chinese language schools with, say, those in Japan, as well as in Australia. As many years ago, actually, we did a study in Australia as well. There, it's large, partly because, for example, in city of Melbourne, you can apply for University of Melbourne. They have multicultural policies through Chinese test. So the Chinese language learning becomes very important. And the interesting thing here is that, for example, in Japan, they're like in Tokyo, there are 500,000 Chinese, but there's only 1 or 2 weekend Chinese schools, and the enrollments are not as large as you've kind of the numbers you have shown here. So I think there's something that's interesting about the Chinese in Germany. Maybe it's the newest, maybe it's the ethnic minority status, in a sense that they're more visibly, ethnic minority, and maybe there's something that there, I think it would be interesting to explore. Yeah, I mean, hope we can all be mobile, and you can come to Japan and study the communities here, and that would be a lot of interesting collaboration we can do. Right. We just want to use this opportunity to advertise our next event. The next event will be actually in 2 weeks, and this will be a mini symposium given by 2 authors who have written 2 interesting books on Nikkei Brazilians. So there are 2 new books. So one is by Dr. Suma Ikeuchi, taking religion seriously, Nikkei Pentecostal Christians and their quest for new origin stories. And second is by Sarah LeBaron from Bayer, whose book is actually called the transnational, the routes and roots. And sorry, I can't remember, because it was a fascinating a book. And this talk is on 3 decades of Japanese Brazilian labor migrants in Japan. And her book actually talked about children as well. So it's a very interesting. And then we also have Professor Ross, who's going to discuss, and Ross is one of the earlier researchers on the Nikkei Brazilian community. So yeah, please, you can click on the link and register if you're interested. And we will also have many other events in the future. In February, we'll have another joint workshop with Birmingham, talking about how COVID is affecting the migrants in both the UK and in Japan. So Zhou Talo is going to give a talk, and also the director of the Institute for Research into Super Diversity, Jenny Phillimore, is giving a talk as well. So we'll have 2 talks on that topic. So just just keep tuned in, and we'll send you all this information later as well. So yes, and thank you very much for coming and for being here with us. And also let's give a round of applause virtually, or or you can throw your emoji to Wang Zi for the fascinating presentation and a very informative a presentation. And we're certainly looking forward to hearing more about your research in the future. Okay, I think I'm done here. And Jyotaro, anything that I have missed? Aileen? Okay.
I think you say everything, but the information regarding this mini symposium is still not on the website, but we will upload in a few days. So please visit a little bit later, but definitely you can find the information on our website later. And if you are registering to our mailing list, I think you already received the information. So please close your email to register. Thank you.
Right.
Aileen, do you have
Yeah. Wang Zi kindly lets us record the talk, and then we'll upload that onto our website as well. And do check in on our very nice Institute of Asian Migrations website. I think it's Aileen who did a very wonderful video for the front page, homepage of our website. So it's very unique. All right, thank you all, and just have a good evening, and hope to see many of you next time.
Yeah.
Thank you, Russia. Thank you, everyone.